So this is the historical context part of the course. And I hope this is interesting for you and informative. And most of all, I hope it helps you answer the question, so what? Why does this matter? How should knowing about Haydn and where he came from and his music change how we play it? And this is not exhaustive. There is many more things that you could discover that I hope you discover. This is just a springboard to get you started on that journey and to give you an idea of where this music comes from. As you probably know, this string quartet was written by Joseph Haydn. It is Opus 64, number 4 in G major, and sometimes it's also called number 51, his 51st string quartet. Joseph Haydn was an Austrian composer that lived from 1732 to 1809, and he was a very, very prolific composer. And just kind of as a time frame, his life bookends that of Mozart. Haydn, as I said, wrote a ton of music, and depending on how you count, he wrote over 500 major works, including 68 string quartets. So when it comes to string quartets, he knew what he was doing, and many people call him the father of the string quartet. And so much of what we have in the genre today is based on what Haydn started back then. Much of Haydn's career was spent at the Esterhazy Palace as a court musician for the Esterhazy family. And he was somewhat insulated from the outside world when he was there, and so he is a very original composer. What you get in Haydn is Haydn, and he was responsible for the musical output of the palace. At the beginning, he was just a court musician, and then later on, he was promoted to Kapellmeister. He was in charge of all of the music for the Esterhazy Palace. In 1790, Prince Miklos, or Nicholas, died, who was Haydn's employer, and his son, Anton, took over. And Anton wasn't so interested in the musical establishment that the Esterhazy family had built up, and so many of the musicians were let go. Haydn fared better, and he was essentially retired. He was given a pension, and he had very limited responsibilities for the Esterhazys, and so he was able to go and do what he wanted. And at that time, in 1790, in December, I believe it was, he boarded a ship to go to London, and his music had spread over the years, and he was a very popular composer even outside of Austria. There are 6 string quartets in Opus 64, and of course we're learning number 4. They were composed in 1790, so right at the very end of Haydn's tenure as Kapellmeister at Esterhazy, and they were likely some of the last pieces that Prince Miklos heard before he died in September of 1790. Quartet number 5, Opus 64 number 5, is the Lark. It's a very famous quartet that you've probably heard. The Opus 64 quartets were dedicated to Johann Tost, and Tost was a friend of Haydn's. He was a violinist at Esterhazy, and at one point he had also helped Haydn get some music published. So the big question is, so what? Why does this matter? Why does it matter that they were written in 1790? Beethoven was 20 years old, so it's before the Romantic period. It's towards the later end of the classical period, but still very firmly in the classical style. And so how should we approach the music because we know this? Well, I think that in the classical style, there's a certain balance and style that we have to have. And the phrases have to be balanced, the dynamics have to be balanced, the articulation has to be balanced. If we swing too far to either side, either to too light or to too heavy, or to too loud or too soft, then we lose some of the character of the classical style, which is all about balance. So what we do in one part of the phrase, often we have to do the opposite in the other part of the phrase so that there's this balance, right? I'm going to use the word a lot, but so much of what we do in our decisions about dynamics and articulations are about balance. Esterhazy, the actual house itself, was off in the countryside, and Haydn was no doubt surrounded by beautiful hills. If you've ever been to Austria, it's just a beautiful place. And the countryside and peasants and markets and that type of thing. And so when we think about the second movement in particular, I want you to think about how the countryside and the rusticness and the earthiness of that may have influenced Haydn's take on the minuet and trio in the second movement. There's a tendency to play it really light because it goes very well if it's a very light dance type feeling. But we have to remember where it was written, right? At Esterhazy, in a palace still, so it's still a dance place, a formal dance, right? But surrounded by countryside and maybe some peasants and some earthiness and some animals, right? And so there's this kind of this heaviness to it that I think we need to have as well. And again, balance. We can't go too far to that side. We have to keep the royal dance in it as well. But that's just to give you an idea of maybe how to approach the second movement. The third movement is really difficult to find the sound and the tempo that you should take. And it's going to differ depending on the space that you're in and the group. But you have to find a type of sound that is not heavy and that's not too romantic. Don't cover it up with a lot of vibrato. It has to be kind of swaying, kind of like a lullaby, really singing and really sweet, and yet not too fast, right? Not falling over itself. And the viola and the second violin have a really difficult part of getting these even da-dee, 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 all of those things, right? And so you just play around with the tempi, play around with the colors, and I would encourage you, when you approach this movement in particular, instead of thinking about dynamics all the time, think about colors. It's very repetitive, and you're going to run out of dynamics if you just try to go back and forth. And so you have to think about colors, especially when you go to the minor middle section. You have to find a really special darkness to that. It's unlike anything else in the rest of the piece. And so do your best to make that really special. And it's a little sad, right? But there's still some hope in it. And it ends so joyfully, but in a subdued way, right? There's this kind of hope in the whole third movement. So work on your sound to get that feeling. In the fourth movement, it's really jaunty, right? And it just goes. And if it's too proper, then it doesn't quite have the feeling, okay? So get down into the string. If you're in a bigger space, right, it's okay if you just go for it, right? Don't try to make it too proper and too clean. At least that's my interpretation of it. You can totally do something different. But remember, there's this kind of rusticness to it. And so try different ways, try different tempi to see if you can get the right character for the mood.